Hello everybody, how are you today? Enjoyed our little Zoom chat. We'll keep that up, do it twice a week as we move through the rest of the semester. So now we're into fresh material. We're into material that's taking place after midterm 3. So we're now forming the basis of the final exam. Let's talk about jury trials, and we do this in two parts. One is the first part, that is Module 12, Lecture 12, is about jury selection, and then jury decision making comes in Chapter 13. If you see this moving around a little bit, Iris is coming to play, so we'll have to kind of deal with that. Iris, where's Iris? Come here, Friss. Iris. Iris's nickname is Friss, F-R-I-S-Y, because when we took her to the vet for the first time, they made a keystroke entry mistake, so Iris became Friss. And it was funny because they sent me a reminder for my cat Friss, and I'm like, I don't have a freaking cat Friss. It took me a while to figure out it was Iris, and now Friss is her nickname. Iris. She's not going to come by. All right, so. Cats never do what you want them to do when you want them to do it. That's a general rule. Let's look at the jury selection process. It's in two parts. First of all, we assemble a pool of jurors, and this is the group from which we'll select. So these are potential jurors. That's the pool of jurors. And this has got the fancy French term of drawing the veneer, that is, creating the pool. Once you have a pool, though, the next logical step is to then pick people from the pool to actually sit on the jury. And again, we're going to look at a French term, voir dire. This is the process of choosing jurors from the pool. Voir dire, for you French, remember I had 3 years of high school French, so I could kind of maybe get my way through this, is to see and to speak. So to see and to speak. And notice during this process of jury selection, this is the first time that everyone involved in the process sees the jurors, the potential jurors, and then chooses them. So it's our opportunity to see and to hear them speak, to answer questions, etc. So jury selection then, what are the overarching goals? It should be goal is to draw a fair, unbiased, and representative jury. So notice this is two pieces. Fair is considered unbiased, or unbiased is synonymous with fair in this context, and representative. Now what does it mean, representative? It means that the jury will be drawn from your community, right? So when we hear jury of your peers, it's jury of your community members, and that's an important distinction. Court rulings since the 1880s have said you can't exclude potential jurors because of membership in a cognizable group. So if we can define a group and then put this person, define them as a member of that group, we can't exclude them on the basis of their group membership. Cognizable is just a fancy word, is can we intellectually construct this as a group, deriving from the same root word as cognition. But until the mid-1960s, although that was a goal, until the mid-1960s, jurors were overwhelmingly white middle-aged men. Or white elderly men. And we'll see that in part that necessarily is changing, but perhaps not fast enough for some people's taste. There's been no consistent method for choosing jurors, so there really are as many different methods as there are locations or jurisdictions. In 1961 we see 92 different methods in 92 federal courts for selecting for the process of voir dire and jury selection, building the pool. So let's look. One way to remediate this is to look at the Jury Selection and Service Act of '68. Resulted from a series of Supreme Court decisions, and finally someone gets around to doing something. It led the federal courts to seek uniform criteria to determine who is excluded. And it was propelled by the idea that heterogeneous juries are more desirable. Heterogeneous synonymous with diverse, right? So it's a jury of our peers, right? Drawn from our jurisdiction. The idea is that these folks will be better fact finders. Now that's not necessarily empirically supported, but that is the intent, right? Diversity will discourage majority group members from expressing prejudice, and this is majority group members within the society. Does this work or not? Well, psychologists, social psychologists especially, can seek to answer these questions, give us some insight to this. Lab studies tend to say that heterogeneous groups, that is diverse groups, make better decisions, but this is a place where the disconnect from laboratory research to what we observe in real life can be pretty drastic. Lab studies do say yes, but the tasks that are tested in the laboratory are often much more complex and really much different than jury decision-making tasks. Organizational studies often say yes. Lab studies tend to include a relatively simple right-wrong, yes-no paradigm, incorrect versus correct solutions. And one of the criteria that's used in a lot of laboratory research has been the speed with which decisions are made. And that might be constituted or operationalized as better within this context. So there is quite a big difference, in the relevance of lab studies in this decision. But what do we know? And what do we know and how might we apply it? Well, will diversity discourage the expression of prejudice? That might be one issue. If we have a diverse jury, then maybe who someone's extremely prejudiced won't express that prejudice within the jury deliberations, right? Maybe so. And there's evidence that people often don't want to speak out when they're going to go contrary to popular opinion or any opinion at all. Often extreme opinions are inhibited by the presence of diverse members. But it also has its downfalls. I mean, and one set of studies that looked at the concept of post-suppressional rebound is participants were asked to suppress stereotypes, consciously suppress these stereotypes, but then later on in the laboratory study they were given an opportunity to speak freely. And we find under those conditions in the previous suppression participants, they then express those opinions with even greater intensity once they're allowed to. So repression leads to more extreme expression of viewpoints, at least in that set of studies. But we might see contrast effects that are possible too. That is, if we encounter someone who is expressing a very, let's say, hostile and extreme opinion, then many people who are kind of middle of the road then back off, and we find that they actually moderate their opinion and kind of go the other direction with it. So it really depends on the nature of the study and the circumstances that the participants are exposed to. We can see kind of drastically differing results in this regard. Now, another way we might look at this is, does diversity of a jury then encourage public acceptance of the legitimacy of verdicts? And if you go back to when we were talking about the trial process, way back in Lecture 9 when we were talking about Miller and Bolster, maybe it's not that it's a fair process, but maybe we need to create the appearance of a fair process. And a diverse jury might assist with this. But again, it's kind of yes and no. We look at the Rodney King verdict, and we saw, the police brutality that was directed towards Rodney King, and we saw the officers, 4 officers from Los Angeles Police Department brought up on charges of police brutality. But it was an all-white jury in the Simi Valley in Ventura County rather than Los Angeles County, and the officers were acquitted of any wrongdoing. This is a largely white jury, and what happens? Well, Los Angeles exploded into riots, right? So there's a case. But now the O.J. Simpson verdict, if we look at that, the first verdict, right, with the Brown, Nicole Simpson and murder, we see that we had a diverse jury, and O.J. was found not guilty. Interestingly, though, and Dr. Fazio did some of this research, right after, the polarization was amazing. If you ask African American citizens, hey, what do you think? Was that a good verdict for O.J.? And like 98% are saying, yeah, fair verdict. If you asked white people at the same time what happened, about 95% are saying no, it was an unfair verdict. So the diverse jury did not lead to a perception of fairness. Again, I think this is something that's got to be taken on a case-by-case basis. I think the circumstances have a profound effect on people's perceptions. So let's talk about drawing the veneer, that is, getting ourselves a jury pool, and let's see how that kind of interacts with the idea of diversity. 68 law requires voter registration list to be the primary source. Okay. And then you say, okay, so voter registration. But then if we're using voter registration rolls to then solicit people to be on juries, who doesn't register to vote is going to be who is omitted from potentially serving on a jury. Who do we know statistically that has kind of low voter turnout and low voter registration? Young people. So young people will be underrepresented on the jury because they don't register to the same extent. People who move frequently and don't keep up with their voter registration. Now that might not be an issue necessarily, that category. We also know that the poor and minorities tend to register in smaller numbers historically, and this is where it can be problematic because now those folks will be underrepresented on the jury, and that could be a problem. So what could you do? And it's pretty straightforward. Of problems to solve, there are tough problems, there are simple problems. Let's take an easy problem to solve. Hey, we can just use other lists. We go beyond voter registration, sure, keep that list, but let's augment it with licensed drivers. Or, and notice, almost everyone has a driver's license or a public ID card. So that would cast a very wide net for folks. Public assistance is a way if we want to get at perhaps people who are out of work or poor, the unemployed. So all of these lists could be used to kind of diversify the jury pool. That doesn't mean we're going to end up with a diverse jury, but at least the pool it's being drawn from would demonstrate greater diversity. Now, let's suppose that diversity becomes a core issue. What you can then do is stratify to match the community. So if you're looking at a community, let's say that's 60% white, 20% black, and 20% Hispanic, then what we could do is create a jury pool that reflects the community. That is, so the jury pool will be 60% white, 20% black, and 20% Hispanic, and then we'll work from that. But that's still no guarantee that that will be the representation on the jury. It would just be the people who are brought into the jury pool for the process of voir dire. Note that we often do this in our laboratory research. If we want 50-50 males and females, and I have, I get to some point where I'm looking at 200 participants, and I've already got 100 females, then I might then just solicit males from that point on to stratify my participant pool. So this is something that's relatively easy to accomplish if we believe it to be useful and necessary. Now, can the unbiased pool still lead to a biased jury? And this is then, how does the process of voir dire work in this regard? Those who are excluded or removed may be systematically different than the final set of jurors. So who would tend to be systematically excluded under almost all conditions? Well, the blind, sometimes, and we can see that if there's visual evidence that needs to be processed, someone might make a case that the blind people shouldn't be necessarily on the jury. The mentally handicapped are typically excluded. That is thought that they may not be able to process the information effectively that they're going to see. Non-English speakers are typically excluded because the trial process in the United States is going to take place in English. So in fact, people will want to keep it an English-speaking jury. Non-citizens don't serve on juries, and felons don't serve on juries. That last point, the felons, is kind of an interesting one. Let's face it, the many people who are facing trial are convicted felons, and if you're looking for representation from the community, and I'm a felon, I'm being tried and I've been previously convicted, would it be beneficial to have felons on the jury who are my peers? Likely not, and I wouldn't look for that to change. The one place we do see changes taking place now, will we allow convicted felons, people who've served their time, to now participate in the voting process? That's another issue, where we see that felons in some jurisdictions are campaigning for the right to vote. Now, groups who used to be summarily dismissed, but not necessarily. Well, the deaf. And the judge ruled that deafness cannot be used as a cause for dismissal. Interpreters are now available, and this should not be necessarily a cause for dismissal. Now, this is where it gets very kind of misogynistic. Women have never served on juries until 1898, so you look at a country that had been functioning for almost 100 years, 110 years give or take, never a woman on the jury. Only 4 states by 1920 had women on the jury. And notice 1910, 1920s was a time for the advancement of women's rights, right? So we can see where this kind of gained some steam. But look how slowly changes take place. In 1957, women in Florida had to register to serve. That is, in Florida, you had to then, as a woman, say, I want to serve, and you had to go sign up, right? You weren't automatically encouraged to come and into the jury pool. In 1966, the Supreme Court, right, held that Mississippi could exclude. This is 1966, right? This is not that long. I know it's a long time ago for you, but it's not a long time ago for me necessarily. That Mississippi could legally exclude women because they needed to contribute their services as wives and homemakers. Anyone pissed off? And they needed to be protected from the filth, obscenity, and noxious atmosphere of the courtroom. And what do we call this kind of racism or sexism? Anyone? This is what we call benevolent sexism. That is, we have to protect you because you're a woman, so you're not going to be involved in the court thing because it's so obnoxious and threatening. So women used to be summarily dismissed. In 1975, Taylor versus Louisiana, a lot of different cases, ruled that jury service could not be confined to just men, right? But, and that women, like men, had to be paid for their service, so you can assume that prior to this, men would be paid for their jury duty. Obviously it's not much, but women would not be paid. Until '79, women in Missouri could be automatically exempted by signing a form and returning it. And for those of us who don't want to do jury duty, right, that would be awesome, and it's not the way it goes, right? When I was called to do jury duty, and it was a big case, it was a murder case, it has nothing to do with me, but I mean, they were going to have a huge jury pool. They wanted about 200 jury members because they were afraid that many of us had heard about the case, formed pre-existing opinions about the case, and you know, I wanted to be excused from this. Why did I want to be excused? Because they were talking maybe a 2-month trial. It could have been that long, and we were mid-semester. It would be tough for me to just hop out in mid-semester. What happens to all my classes at that point in time? That can be problematic. If there's not a substitute available, what happens? Do those classes just get canceled? Do you guys, you know, is that just the end of it? And the department, psychology department, actually wrote me a letter on behalf of the university and asked that I be excused. And when I went and appeared, I presented the letter to the judge and the attorneys, and they said, yeah, we're going to excuse you because it would create a hardship for many other people, right? Who might then, I don't know, what do? Drop the class midway through? Does that impact people's graduation requirement? You guys know these concerns because you've had them now that we're in this pandemic situation. Anyway, women could still be automatically exempted. So, and let's look at this opinion here. This is kind of a famous attorney, and I'll just read this as it is here. Women still take their new privilege seriously. They're all puffed up with the importance of the part they feel they play. And they're sure they represent a great step forward in the world. They believe that the sex is cooperating in a great cause. Like the rest of us, they don't know which way is forward, which way is backward, or whether either way is any way at all. Luckily, I feel as my services were almost over when women invaded the jury box. And this is, maybe you know from the picture, yes, this is the famous attorney Clarence Darrow. Doesn't sound like he was a great supporter of women entering into this process, as many people were not at the time. So, we've talked about assembling the jury pool, and we've talked about the different methods for doing that. What we need to do now is we're going to go on to the goals of voir dire, and I think this is a natural breaking spot, so I'm going to break here for part 1, and we'll just pick up where we left off. Remember, we got a jury pool, and we've discussed how that jury pool is assembled and how modifications have been made to that process over time to increase what would be perceived as the fairness and the representativeness of the jury. So let's now go into part 2 with a jury pool, and let's see what the hell we do with the jury pool.